South.
Well, good morning, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. Thank you very much for allowing me to join this debate today. Mr. Speaker, this debate is the furthest from hypothetical debates I think that we could find. And I want to begin by commending my colleague from Sydney, Victoria, for bringing his motion, which is extremely important. He's a very, very, very active advocate for agricultural producers, for agribusiness, and he understands, viscerally understands, the role and the purpose of Canada's agricultural sector in a larger economic context, a theme I'm going to come back to in a few moments. But I do want to begin by going back to first principles for listeners or readers of this debate, people watching perhaps. Let's remind each other and all of ourselves together, let's collectively recall that Canada's railroads were built chiefly with the leadership of government, and that they had a unique foundational role to play in helping to kickstart our economy and build this, underpin this postmodern economy that we now live in. In fact, rail is indispensable to Canada's economic success. That is woven into the fabric and the tissue of the specifics that my colleague from Sydney, Victoria wants to see examined in his important motion. What have we seen with respect to this government and how it interfaces with the transportation sector and its responsibility for transportation? The first thing, Mr. Speaker, I'd say on that front is this. Governments have an obligation always to get the big things right. The big things. The things that Canadians count on. And one of the chief responsibilities of a federal government is transportation. Transportation policy, transportation regulation, transportation enforcement, and so on and so forth. We've seen an increase in agricultural production. This is true. We've seen an increase in natural resource exploitation. We've seen an increase in the transportation of oil by rail. And we've seen stability, if not a slight increase, in passenger rail transportation across Canada. The government knows this. In fact, for almost a decade now, they have watched this growth. But as my colleague from Sydney, Victoria pointed out, what we have seen is the government reacting in knee-jerk fashion. It's almost as if they're jumping from ice flow crisis to another ice flow crisis, depending on the crisis of the week, month, or year. So much so, Mr. Speaker, that now our rail system is in flux. It's in crisis. We have ships waiting off the coast of Canada, the west coast, waiting for our grain, waiting for our agricultural products, sometimes waiting for our other natural resources. We've seen massive 1,200% increase in the transportation of oil by rail. The government's known this for almost a decade. We've seen a crisis emerge in passenger rail services in the country. Complaints from Quebec, all over northern Quebec. Complaints from Sarnia, Sault Ste. Marie, and so many other smaller parts of Canada that are witnessing a decline in service, decline in frequency, decline in availability. So on all fronts, we have a problem. Now, what has been the government's reaction to this problem in almost a decade? Its first reaction, Mr. Speaker, was to appoint 5 ministers, 5 transportation ministers, in less than 9 years. No minister can take on a portfolio like Transport Canada seriously and commit the time and effort that's required to improve the transportation system by flitting in and flitting out, either heading up, heading down, or heading out of cabinet. And this is what we've seen with a succession of cabinet ministers. One of the things I've noticed, Mr. Speaker, in my time as the transportation critic for the Liberal Party of Canada is a proximity of relationship between the regulated railway sector and the regulator at Transport Canada. This has deeply concerned me. This relationship is, in my view, and I don't say this lightly, I believe the relationship between Transport Canada, its minister, its staff, its good officials, and the regulated sector, the railways, is too close. It's too cozy. It's almost too integrated. And we've seen this as we studied the safety management systems that apply as much to the transportation of grain as they do to the transportation of oil. The facts are, as I mentioned, 5 ministers in 9 years. An Auditor General's report, which can only be described, Mr. Speaker, as scathing. It's a scathing report over a 4-year period where the Auditor General ferreted through what was happening at Transport Canada and came back with some incredibly problematic and troubling findings. Things like, in a 4-year period, this government has not had Via Rail, with its millions and millions of rail passengers a year, not once in 4 years has Via Rail been audited by a qualified inspector for its safety management system. In the entire rail sector, only 25% of all the audits that were supposed to have been done, planned by the government, were in fact done. It doesn't increase our confidence in rail safety, particularly in response to and after the terrible tragedy of McGuinty in Quebec. As my colleague pointed out, penalty provisions. The minister was buttonholed last week by media and on camera, said, well, we'll have to see whether we're going to fine and how much we're going to fine. For agricultural producers out there and shippers, they have to know that what the government's done is said first, well, it'll be $100,000 a day of fines. Whoops, no, it's not going to be $100,000 a day. Now it's $100,000 a week. Well, actually, no, it's not $100,000 a week either. In fact, it's ministerial, it's full of discretion. So the minister will decide when she feels like it, or whoever's minister next. Whoever the minister is will decide, I don't know on what grounds, on what basis. I have no idea. Criteria is not clear. But they'll decide whether or not the railway company should be fined. And the fines, Mr. Speaker, the fines don't go to the shippers. Right. No, they don't go to those who have been affected by the choices made by the railways or the constraints imposed on the railways. No, the fines are paid to the government, not to the shippers who have got liquidated damages with crops and yields and grains sitting in storage waiting to get onto ships that are moored off the coast of BC. So again, it makes no sense, but these are the kinds of changes and actions the government's brought in, again, in a very ad hoc way, dealing with a bottlenecked railway system. You know, our prairie provinces, Mr. Speaker, are the world's top canola producing region. It's incredible what we've done. It's incredible what our agricultural producers have done, the efficiency, the environmental sensitivity, the quality of the grain. We're the second largest exporter of wheat, up 14% to record 81 million metric ton levels in a short number of years. What's really going on, Mr. Speaker, we think here in the Liberal Party of Canada is this relationship between the regulator and the regulated, the railway companies being regulated. It appears as if the railways are now picking and choosing, based on profit margins, what they will or will not essentially ship. I know that some volume standards have been brought to bear, but even these don't actually deal with the crisis that's in play. So, to recap, Mr. Speaker, we've got our shippers who are captive. They have no competitive commercial alternatives, no legal recourse when the system fails. The threat and fines have no real impact. They're no substitute for liquidated damages for the shippers that are affected. The government's brought in an order to move certain minimum volumes of grain. That expired in November 2014, making it up again as they go along. What we need is this motion. We need a comprehensive examination of the rail transportation system to get it right and get it better. We owe it to Canadians, we owe it to our future, we owe it to our economy, and we owe it we really do owe it to the future success of Canada, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much.
Excellent.